down the line.
Okay.
All right. So what we're looking at here, of course, is the heart. And make sure that you know the parts on the exterior of the heart as well as the interior heart. So here we have the aorta. If I flip it over, you can see the inferior vena cava. And if I turn it this way, you can see the superior vena cava. Looking at the heart again, this is the tip of the heart, so that's the apex. This thing right here, that valve, is called the coronary artery. If this gets blocked, that's what's going to cause a heart attack. On the inside, a great question. Let's see which one looks really good for that. A really good question that I'm going to ask is what makes this heart different from the adult heart? And you should remember that the blood never goes to the lungs for oxygenation because they get their oxygen from the umbilical cord. So there's actually a hole between the right and left atrium. You should also be able to tell the difference between the right and left side. Remember, the left side is going to pump the systemic circulatory system. So that's going to...
just bring this over like this.
Ryan, talk quieter. Your voice is on tape. Okay, so that's going to be much thicker than the right side. So don't look at anatomic right and left because you won't be able to tell. Look at the thickness of the ventricle to ID. Okay, way other side of the body is the kidneys. This is a great kidney for me to do an open look at because you can clearly see the difference between the renal cortex, the renal medulla, and the renal pelvis. If I look at the outside of the kidney, yeah, see that little opening? That's going to go to the ureter. So that's this is a good one for me to use for that. Okay, moving on. This is the spleen. One of the questions that I'm going to ask is where in the body would this be found? So keep in mind that you want to do anatomical right and left. So this was on the anatomical left upper abdominal quadrant. So upper left abdomen. Now the spleen has a lot of different functions. One of the functions is to store blood. In case you get a large blood loss, it can release that blood and you don't go into hemorrhagic shock. It also has lymphatic functions in that it filters your blood and gets rid of some of the pathogens. Okay, stomach. Primarily in the upper left quadrant of your abdominal quadrant, right underneath your diaphragm, which is what differentiates between thoracic and abdominal. When we look at the stomach, you're going to be asked to differentiate between the pyloric, which is the one that's really thick, the pyloric sphincter, and the cardiac sphincter. The pyloric sphincter is going to go from the stomach into the small intestine, and its function is to make sure that the chyme doesn't go across too fast into the small intestine. The cardiac sphincter, its job is to make sure there isn't reflux into the esophagus. If there is, the acid gets into your esophagus, and that's why you get heartburn. Okay, other questions I can ask. The stomach itself is a collapsible muscular bag. In the interior of the stomach, the lumen of the stomach, there are gastric pits. In the gastric pits, pepsinogen and hydrochloric acid are released. Hydrochloric acid turns the pepsinogen into pepsin, so protein starts to get digested. But the primary function of the stomach is to store food and to destroy bacteria that may enter because of the pH difference. Okay, liver. Really big organ. It is across the entire top of the abdominal cavity. Mostly on the right though. It does a lot of important stuff. One of them is detoxify your blood. The other one is to be a reservoir for sugar in the form that when there's lots of insulin, it polymerizes into glycogen. When there's a lot of glucagon, it releases that as glucose. It also makes bile, but the bile is stored in this little organ, which is your gallbladder. From the gallbladder, the bile goes through the common bile duct into the first third of the small intestine, the duodenum or duodenum. Bile is an emulsifying agent, so it doesn't break down fat per se, but it does emulsify it. These are your lungs. Like with a lot of the organs, I may ask you what is the functional unit. The functional unit of the lungs, of course, is the alveoli or the alveolar sac. The oxygen goes from, I'm looking for it, but I'm not saying, oh good, from the trachea into the lungs, and then it goes into the lungs via the bronchi, breaks into bronchioles, which are not seen here, and then into the alveoli, which you can barely see in these little bumpy looking things in here.
That was pretty good.
Here are the small intestines. Remember, those are the first third.
No, but they have
The
to
first third
finish-
is where most digestion occurs. The second 2/3 is where most absorption occurs. The digestive enzymes for the stomach come from the pancreas in the form of pancreatic amylase. I'm sorry, pancreatic fluid, which includes pancreatic amylase, lipase, sodium bicarbonate, and one more. Mr. Reinhardt, what's the fourth pancreatic fluid? Pancreatic amylase, lipase, sodium bicarbonate, and trypsin. Okay. I'll take it. Okay. The surface area of the stomach, of the small intestine, is made much greater because it has villi and microvilli. Here's your large intestine, also known as your spiral colon. This part right here is the cecum, which is analogous to our appendix, and this is analogous to the rest of our large intestine or colon. Most water is absorbed in this. A great question would be if too much water is absorbed, what happens, or if there's not enough water is absorbed, what happens. All right, this is a fun one to look at because I can ask a lot of questions.
Those are ours.
Good. This is the trachea, and notice the cartilaginous rings that open the trachea. Keep it open. Behind the trachea is the esophagus. Might be easier to see that here. See that tube that goes in behind that? That's the esophagus. This right here is the larynx, and you can see the vocal cords inside the larynx. Over here, we have the pancreas. Now the pancreas, they look a little different, so you might want to look at several of them. The pancreas is found underneath the stomach, on top of the small intestines, in the upper left quadrant of the abdomen, and it has two jobs. It does both makes both pancreatic fluid for the exocrine system, and it makes insulin and glucagon, which is part of the endocrine system. If we move over here, it's hard to find a good dissection of these. This one's probably the best. And that's your thymus. The thymus is located right on top of the heart. And its function, of course, is where the T cells mature. Remember, the T cells are made in the bone marrow, move to the thymus, and are maturing there, and they're part of your cell-mediated immunity. This is the best one I have, but you might want to do a scan of all of them. This, of course, is the thyroid, located right over the larynx, and the thyroid is involved in controlling metabolism by producing thyroxine. One more over. This is the urinary bladder. Urinary bladder, of course, is where the urine is going to be stored.